We're going to get started. Very important panel with two people that I have tremendous amount of respect for, and I actually like them. I like.
He has to say
your
that.
reputation is in peril right now if you say that publicly around Austin.
Just to remind you that there is CLE for those of you that are lawyers. You can sign up in the back for it. And the title, which I just read, but I don't want you to think we didn't prepare. I thought it was on weaponization, but it's actually blind justice ensuring the system protects the people, which really truly fits with what all of us up here are passionate about. We have with us today the Honorable Brian Harrison. I know him.
If I am referred to as the Honorable, I'm going to leave. There's no self-respecting human being allows themselves to be called the Honorable. It's the most ridiculous title. I'm Brian. Great to be here.
So I will tell you, I had the opposite approach. I required my children to refer to me as "Oh Great Father" for the first 10 years. For the first 10 years, they had to call me "Oh Great Father." It backfired when I went to elementary school, and my daughter Haley said, "Hey, oh great father, you're here." Other parents didn't think that was so funny, but we're great to have Brian here. I think of him as sort of the chief of staff to HHS, which he served in the first term of Trump. And really curious to get his take on RFK Jr., which I'm very excited about what's going to happen, changes that are going to happen in this country. But he represents District 10, and he's on the Appropriations Committee and Corrections Committee. He's done a ton of things. I'm not going to go over everything. Just Google him.
Don't torture these people.
Don't torture these people. Same with me. You can Google me, and not all of that's true.
Just turn on Fox TV and we'll see you.
Yeah.
Normally.
Very happy to have Jessica here, Jessica Steinman. She is a phenomenal leader, serves as general counsel to America First Policy Institute before. Yep. Before that, she worked for Senator Ted Cruz, and yes, absolutely. And the real accomplishment that I will point out is just 12 weeks ago, she gave birth to a 10-pound baby. So.
Yes, I have a little 12-week-old and a 2-year-old. So our house is a madhouse right now. 2 little boys, so it's going to probably get worse, I'm told.
And on one occasion, she saved me at a conference because I purchased a new jacket and I had tags on it, and she walked up to me and said, "Hey, I don't think you want those tags on, do you?" And she cut them off for me, so I'll forever appreciate her loyalty.
How about a friend?
Yes. So, yes, that does. So today what we want to talk about is, I think a subject that we obviously all are very passionate about, and that is we're seeing a shift and a dynamic change in this country. A sense of optimism is permeating. It's not happening with everyone. Just recently, I received out of the blue a message from my nephew, who I've loved my whole life. He's 36 years old, and he indicated he's done with me. Yeah, absolutely done, because he can't believe that I support Trump and that I support, my good friend Pam Bondi, and that I'm helping to get Kash Patel confirmed, and he has bought into all of what the media for so many years has been saying, and I don't actually blame him, because if that's your echo chamber, then you're afraid right now. You're afraid. You're living in fear, and you think that the country is going in a direction that's scary, and you didn't realize that you were just being led down the primrose path gently by the left over these past decades. The government growing and becoming more powerful, and the people growing less powerful. That's really, in essence, what we're going to talk about. So I'll let these two give you a little bit of initial comments, but we want to talk about the abuse that we're aware of, what efforts are going to happen and are happening now to rein in government and protect people. We want to talk about DOJ and criminal justice, but it's bigger than that. It's bigger than that, and we're going to address all of that. So, Brian, we'll turn to you, and then Jessica.
Sure. Thrilled to be here with you this morning. It's a little surprising. I was able to get a break from the Texas House. We have had just a crushing schedule of passing birthday resolutions and resolutions to honor Beyonce. So I'm very happy that I was able to take a step away from all of that inaction to be here with you today. Because at least in this room, I'm in a room. Tell me, am I right? Am I in a room with people that actually want to deliver bold conservative victories for the people of Texas? Well, I just left the House floor, so I'm happy that at least one room I'm in today, people want to do that. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. And yes, he did mention I had the very high honor before getting elected here in the state of Texas as serving as President Trump's Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services into the first term, and so I'm very grateful for the work of you and others getting my previous colleagues confirmed, like Kash Patel. Kash was my counterpart at the Defense Department. He was Chief of Staff over there when I was Chief of Staff at HHS, and I'm so thrilled to see the people that are going back for round 2 of this, but I think it's almost like a supercharged, round 2. I know we're going to talk about weaponization and criminal justice issues, but we've never had in the history of our country, and that's what made us unique, quite frankly, a peaceful transition of power. We've never had a situation in American history where one president leaves office only to become the greatest political rival to the powers that be and then have every instrumentation of government weaponized to effectuate the destruction of a political enemy. And if that precedent is allowed to stand, that is the type of thing that can, forget having some impact in election. That's the type of stuff that can destroy the fabric of our republic. And so for any of us who believe in a constitutional republic, and we are a republic, not a democracy, we can't just speak out against this. No, that's important. We lose sight of that a lot. We cannot sit idly by and be silent while two things happen. Government grows, because to pick up on what you said, there's an inverse and a direct correlation between the growth of government and a reduction of liberty. If government's getting bigger, your freedoms and your liberties are going down. So we have government expanding in general, but it's also expanding in the worst possible way, which is it's being used not to do the what is the sole and most important role and responsibility of government, which is to protect our rights, which are not created by government, but are inalienable and are bestowed upon us by our Creator. That's the job of government. Government's getting bigger, and it's being used to enrich crony friendships, and worse, silence, marginalize, prosecute, criminalize political opposition. We should not accept this premise, and I think the state of Texas should be leading the charge against that. So thrilled to be with you this morning.
Well, I just want to start off too. I think today is the 1-month anniversary of Trump taking office, so that's very exciting. Yes. And I know we're going to dive into this a little more with Brett, but just how much we've done this last month is just unprecedented. I think all of us see that. All of us in this room agree on that. But really, where did that all come from? I think it came from, and we're going to talk about this a little more, the last 4 years. I was in the Trump Department of Justice. I was a senior official there, and we were gearing up for our second term and and same as Brian, I'm sure at HHS.
We were ready.
We were ready. We'd gotten in new staff. We had plans. The second term was going to be amazing. Unfortunately, we did not get to stay. But looking back now, I think it really was a God thing that we didn't stay. The amount of work that organizations like AFPI, TPPF, all these other organizations did in that 4 years has made us so much stronger. And honestly, what we've done now, what we've done in this month, I don't want to say, but it could have taken us a year. I don't know where or if we've even have gotten to some of the places that we've done this time. I know, and we'll talk about it a little more, but I think that lead up has taken us to where we are, and just being able to reflect on topics like this, of the weaponization that was going on at DOJ, even when we were there with some of the careers. And I love DOJ. I think most of the careers are good prosecutor. There's good people there, but it's, a handful of bad ones that ruin the whole thing. And so taking a step away from that and sitting down, strategizing, figuring out not just the people who are going back in this time, but really the policies that go back in. And we knew those loopholes this time, and we were ready, day one. I think we had maybe 200 EOs that we've written in the last couple of years, just even at AFPI. Executive orders. So we have those already written, and you've seen some. I think out of the about 56 or so EOs, AFPI had written about 34 of those, and again, there's another about 150 to come. I
just drafted one last week.
Yeah, it's continual. But that kind of work, and again, being able to reflect back and seeing what worked, what didn't, at DOJ and the broader, and we're going to talk about this too, but the broader weaponization of the whole government by the Biden administration. And really, I think we're going to be tearing that apart. So I'll hand it back to you.
Yep. So just as a way of update, I texted Senator Lee, very good close friend of mine. I said, "Where's the vote on Kash Patel?" And he sent back very clear message that it's razor thin, but he thinks we're going to win. So, and he identified who we're losing, and it's who you might think we're losing. But it is what it is. It doesn't matter. We just want to get these good people into these positions. And the left is fighting really hard against it because it goes to the heart of what both Brian and Jessica articulate, and that is we are attempting to do, and I believe this moment in time is more pivotal than any outside of the beginning of our country. And the reason it's so pivotal is because for the first time we're going to expose the abuse of power in the government from those in charge of the government. And that has not been done before. So I want to ask Brian and Jessica to both comment on, you both indicated where you've been. You were in the first term. We became very much aware of, I think, the abuse became more apparent under Biden. What do you see is the objective with what President Trump is doing and the leaders of his cabinet right now? What are they doing to stop the abuse, and what will they put in place to actually prevent it from happening after? Is this a one-time, fix that we might not be able to guarantee going forward? How do we make sure, for example, the Department of Justice, we take away some of its power, we increase accountability, we increase transparency, but does that not just change with the new administration, and what's going to happen in order to change that?
You mentioned DOJ.
I can go. Yeah, sure. So like I said, we'd been preparing, I think, we had a working group, Brett and I, Matt Whitaker, Pam Bondi, a handful of other kind of former DOJ officials that were on our side, at least the last year, probably more than that, working on transition. And we had that for every department. So we would sit down, and again, this isn't the people side, which that's important. It's a little bit easier or faster, I would almost say. But again, just diving into all those policies. And I think DOJ is more difficult than other agencies, right? So other agencies, you can go in, you can pull back regulations, you can change things. DOJ, we make policy through lawsuits a lot of times. So one thing we are looking at is what's called sue and settle. So you have friendly attorney generals or friendly corporations suing the Trump administration, which to all of us seems a little weird. You have, let's say, Paxton is going to sue Trump, but purposely, right? And we come to a decision.
We're asking for it.
You want this to happen, and then they come to a decision together and settle the case, but again, settling it for a policy that we all support. So that's something that we're looking at this administration. But I think the larger picture is, it is long-term, like Brett said. These executive orders are amazing. They're quick change, and we needed that to stop the bleeding, frankly, and that meaning monetary as well, just funding going to left policies. But long-term, we really need the legislation, and here in states, and I'm sure Brian will talk about that more, but at the federal level too. The executive orders, like I said, they're amazing, but they can be short-term. So if someone else gets in, God forbid, in 4 years, in 8 years, we will see a flip-flop of a lot of these. So the long-term work is really working with those congressmen. And I know I live in actually the Woodlands area, so I have Congressman Luttrell. So I was talking to Morgan last week, and he said they are just, getting, as the EOs come in, they're taking them and just right away divvying up who's going to work on this one, who's working on that one. And that's what we need. We need that long-term effect. But I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, and so that's super helpful, and you're right. Just like you guys were at DOJ, at HHS, we were ready for the second term, and it's funny, the media really attacked a lot of the things that we did in December of 2020 or January of 21, as these are midnight regs. In fact, one of my favorite ones, there was an effort I led to sunset all 20,000 federal regulations that HHS had, and I actually got it done right before Biden took over, and so the New York Times put their top 10 most destructive, booby traps we had left for Biden. I was very proud that made the list. But it wasn't supposed to be a midnight reg. That was the foundation for term 2. And actually, let me just take 2 seconds about this, because we're talking about weaponization, but the growth of government and how government is inversely correlated to liberty. One thing that I'm so thrilled to see President Trump and so many of my friends, our friends that are going back to help him, they now are going with a new focus on this. And what I want to focus on this for just a second. It's a little bit philosophical, but the out-of-control regulatory state. When you talk about regulatory policy, I can usually feel eyes and ears glaze over, but just hang on for a second. This is the single biggest threat to our constitutional system of divided government that nobody's ever wanted to talk about before. Now, thank God for once in a generation, we've got President Trump going back on a mandate on this. We've got Elon Musk going in there and the Doge, and everyone's talking about this. But this has been the destruction of our Constitution for over a generation where, unlike what was the original intent of our founders, both our state and our federal constitution set the bar very high for any government to ever act on you, to deprive you of a liberty, or to force any kind of a burden or an action that you must take. You know, the House of Representatives had to agree every jot and tittle with the Senate. The Senate had to agree every jot and tittle with the president. And believe me, that's really hard to do. And our founders knew that. They wanted it to be hard. But what's happened is for over a generation, the legislative bodies, both at the federal, the U.S. Congress, and I hate to say this, at the state levels, legislative bodies have outsourced their constitutional lawmaking responsibilities to unelected bureaucrats in the executive agency, like you used to be and like I used to be. Guys, when I was the chief of staff at HHS, I had more power in the palm of my hand than 100 members of the U.S. Congress put together. I could stand up programs, I could end programs, I could start taxes. Let me give you one quick example. I'll tell the story as fast as I can. Do y'all remember in COVID, early on in COVID, when hand sanitizer was like liquid gold? I mean, you could not get this stuff. And do you remember there were shortages all over the place? And there was one story, it was probably like March or April, where these craft distilleries, whose industries had been ravaged by the pandemic, the restaurants were shut, the bars were shut, and these guys were like, well, we're sitting around, we're not making money, but let's help. They retooled their manufacturing lines to make hand sanitizer, right? And the Today Show, everybody did this a great feel-good story, right? Well, do you know how the federal government thanked them in December of 2020 for like being like a good neighbor and running into a burning building to help their neighbors who were in need? The federal government, one of my sub-agencies, the FDA, enacted a between $20,000 and $40,000 worth of federal taxes on over 600 small distilleries in America because a bureaucrat at the FDA had determined that because they were making hand sanitizer instead of liquor, they were and should be treated and regulated and taxed as over-the-counter drug manufacturing monograph facilities. So not one congressman voted on this tax, not one senator voted on it, a president didn't sign it, and it came out of my agency. I found out of it because a comms person sent me a text to an article in Reason magazine. So I had a midnight meeting, called our lawyers together. I said, first, is this true? They said it was. I said, well, we got to find a way to end this. It wasn't the secretary. He didn't know about it. I was the chief of staff. I didn't know about it. I finally found out who did it. It was an acting mid-level official at one of my agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, had signed a regulation, and with the stroke of his pen, he had enacted tens of thousands of federal taxes on over 600 small businesses in America and almost bankrupted them. I was able to overturn that the next day, but that's the good news. But I will tell you, and you've seen this, most stories like that end poorly. And this kind of thing happens 1,000 times a day. And so we have turned the constitutional premise of governing only at the consent of the governed on its head if you, the governed, aren't making your laws because it's not your elected representatives that are voting on anything. And one statistic, and I'll move on here, is for every one law that is passed or duly enacted by the Congress, over 20 regulations are promulgated by bureaucrats that carry the force of law, the effect of law, but were never voted on by your elected representatives, and that means that the Congress only votes on 5% of all the laws that govern us in America. And I hate to say this, but I'm going to bring it home. Texas has the same problem. Our legislature has outsourced their responsibilities to unelected bureaucrats in our state executive branch agencies, and it is time to bring the power back to the legislature because that's how we give the power back to the people.
Yeah, and to put a finer point on it with respect to the criminal law, for example, this is people ask sometimes, you know, what really is the deep state, or they will mock, you know, the right for being conspiracy theorists, and you know, there's no deep state. Well, here's what actually is the deep state. You look at the Department of Justice. There's 115,000 employees, 11,000 lawyers. Who are all the rest? They are bureaucrats, okay? And then you take every agency, HHS, Homeland, it doesn't matter, every department and every agency, and that is the balance. You have a massive amount of bureaucrats and a few that are elected appointees of the incoming president. So what happens then, these bureaucrats, they sit down, they hunker down, and they survive through multiple presidents, and they are given power to promulgate regulations. And those regulations is why we went from a few thousand criminal statutes under Reagan to we now have over 300,000 criminal regulations and statutes. And so literally, if you have that kind of power and you're a prosecutor or you're an investigator or an FBI agent, right, and then you get politicized, right, what can you do with that power? And that's why it is so critical right now. Like what Brian says and Jessica are saying is there has to be a time and a place for somebody willing to come in and say, we will overhaul in a way that's never been done before this bureaucratic state or deep state, and we will do it through funding, we will do it through regulation, deregulation, we'll do it through the Congress. And that's what you're seeing is a well orchestrated and organized approach to doing that. So what I want to ask Brian, put him on the spot here, what does Texas have to do? And what areas are you most concerned about right now for Texas in terms of holding the government accountable?
Now, it's a great question, and I would say the lowest of low-hanging fruit, tell me if you feel this way sometimes, okay? I'm a little conflicted. Every morning I'm getting up, and I read, 15 more headlines about something amazing that the Trump administration did in Washington, D.C., and I'm like, yes, that's awesome, and then I'm like, this is also embarrassing, because we're Texas. We should have done this years ago. And I think that was one of my big shocks when I got elected 3 years ago, having just spent years serving under President Trump, is that I assumed every elected Republican in Texas was fighting as hard for the freedom and liberty of the next generation as those of us in the Trump administration were. And I was in for a real shock when I got into the Texas House and learned that Democrats control the people's body in the state of Texas. And that the regulatory state is out of control down here. And I'll give you just a couple quick examples of this. I mean, things I was shocked by. I mentioned the sunset rule that I was able to help President Trump do in D.C., where we sunset 20,000 regulations. I thought it would be the easiest thing in the world to just replicate all the deregulatory actions that we did under President Trump for the first term, come codify it into statute, and pass it at the state level. I can't get traction on any of that in the Texas House. And I'll give you an example. Texas has, 30 years ago, the Texas legislature actually did a good thing. They said every 4 years, if you're an agency, you should have to retrospectively review their regs. I was really excited to see this. So I filed a bill, and I simply said, okay, and you can't enforce a reg if it's not been reviewed. You would have thought every state agency in Austin was going to grind to a halt. Okay, they came in and said it's going to cost $50 million for us to comply with a state law that's 30 years old, effectively confessing to me that we haven't reviewed any of our regulations. And how many of you have paid attention? This is another thing I'm excited that has happened recently that never happens on regulatory policy. How many of you heard of the Chevron case at the U.S. Supreme Court? How many of you are very excited to see those bureaucrats have their wings clipped, right? Well, that's great. Here's what's not great. Chevron deference, which for those of you who don't know, that is basically government-sanctioned cheating. When you go to court, if something's happened and you're in a litigation between you're a private individual or you're a private business and you end up on the wrong side of some regulatory bureaucratic agency and you end up in court, what Chevron deference does is it lets the court put their thumb on the scales for the bureaucrats over you. And so if there's like gray area or ambiguity in the law, like, you know what, we think the bureaucrats are smarter than freedom-loving Texans, and we're going to decide in favor of the bureaucrats. That's what Chevron deference is. It's anathema. It would be anathema to our founders. It's what the Supreme Court finally said, we are not doing this at the federal level anymore. But in the state of Texas, ladies and gentlemen, Chevron deference is alive and well, because we cannot pass a bill in the state of Texas to end Chevron deference at the state level. These are some basic, lowest of low-hanging fruits, and it's embarrassing for me to say, and it's especially true watching now, President Trump has done more in 3 weeks to get rid of taxpayer-funded DEI in Texas than the Texas legislature has in the 3 years I've been here. Guys, it's not enough to be doing as much as President Trump, because he's one guy in the biggest swamp of them all. Republicans control all of the levers of power in Texas. We should be leading and doing at least as much and far more than President Trump's able to achieve. So those are a couple of clear examples of things that we need to fix, in my humble opinion, right now while we're in session this year.
So let's talk about what are the solutions, and this can be at the Texas state level. I want to hear your ideas on solutions for what you've articulated as a significant problem. But Jessica, starting with you, what are the solutions? What is Pam Bondi looking at right now in terms of solutions for what we've all watched, which is significant lawfare, right? Using the criminal justice system to actually go after folks. And then beyond that, what's her second priority? What do you think the DOJ's second priority is?
Oh, goodness. So Pam was on, I think most of you guys know, Pam worked for us the last 4 years. So Brett and I, well, Brett's known her for a long time, but I've worked very closely with her, still talk with her very closely. So we talked about the transition group, how we're kind of leading up to that. And one of the big things we talked about was I don't want to say exactly what you saw, but what came out pretty soon after Pam took office is the working group against de-weaponization at DOJ. And so that group, I think there's a whole list of things they're looking at, but the big ones are really focusing on each agency and having them root out their own weaponization. So, DOJ looks at theirs. When Brooke Rollins got to ag, she's doing the same thing there. When Linda McMahon, I think she's getting confirmed today, Linda was our chair also, is getting to education, I guess today or tomorrow. We'll do the same thing there. So really having all those agencies looking at themselves and be able to find it. And I think a lot of the problem is we've got to find the weaponization. It's like you said, the careers are there from administration to administration, 20, 30, their careers, they're there their entire career. And so it's hidden too. So that's a big piece of the puzzle. I think the other pieces that they're looking at, and you saw on day one, is all of these secretaries had a day one plan. And if you hadn't seen, pick your area you want. If it's, again, education, ag, EPA, Lee Zeldin worked for us. Day one, they all came out with, here's, 10 to 15 big picture things they did at each agency. And again, that's in connection with DOJ, so money, funding, but a lot of other specific ones. So specifically at DOJ, it was, again, looking at the J6 issues, basically looking at past prosecutions to look for mismanagement of those prosecutions. And so I think they have 2 investigations right now for the New York cases against Trump, looking into, I know that I think I had a call with DOJ, Tuesday, they're looking at the Eric Adams situation and all the attorneys that quit DOJ after that came out. They're investigating a couple of those attorneys. Really looking at, I think, again, all of these past cases, but current, and I think there were maybe 4 criminal trials against Trump, a bunch of civil trials, just really rooting all that out. So I think that's the big piece of the puzzle we're looking at.
Yeah, it's fascinating. When you finally see that DOJ or the prosecution or the use of the criminal justice system, it became very apparent to regular Americans that the system could be very abusive. If you've seen that show that I believe is a Christmas movie, right? And Bruce Willis was so good in it, right? So there's terrorists in the building, and the FBI finally comes on scene, and what does Bruce Willis say to him? Welcome to the party, pal, right? Like, where you been? That's what Right on Crime we want to say to all of you. Like, welcome to the party. You finally saw the fact that the criminal justice system has broken parts and can be abused. And the power can be used. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't criminals out there that deserve to be prosecuted and put away, and some of them for a long period of time, depending on what their crime is. But it also shows you that we've allowed our criminal justice system and those that wield that power to grow without any accountability and virtually no transparency. So that's why all of a sudden we were shocked to see as a country what they did to Trump, what they did to those that oppose abortion, what they did to conservatives across the country. And so when Jessica talks, I think about the fact that their first line of defense is to actually dig into how bad is the problem. I became aware of a case just a few weeks ago. An individual, not from this country, a wealthy individual posted a positive response to Donald Trump winning the election, and DOJ under Biden launched an investigation after the post. Yeah, and that's using the various laws that they could. I became aware of a very blatant attempt to investigate that individual just based on what he posted on Twitter or X. So this is a problem, and I know Brian's at the heart of it. I want to hear his ideas on solutions for this for Texas, and also solutions for what you've outlined, which is Texas is not leading, right? You're a state that should be leading, and you control all the branches of the government. But in a lot of ways, that's not surprising to me, and it's not to you, I know, because we've seen what happens when Republicans have every branch in D.C. before, and we're like, what did we do? We wasted all 4 years. That's not happening again this time in D.C. What's going to happen in the state? What are the solutions?
Yeah, no, and there's a lot sort of you threw at me right there. So let's take this kind of one thing at a time. I want to pick up on the weaponization of peace first before we switch to criminal justice reform issues. Just one example, because it impacts. I thought of it because it impacts your agency, DOJ, and my old agency, HHS, which is. We saw this lawfare not just against President Trump at a federal level, but and in other states where you see the FACE Act violations from DOJ prosecutors trying to throw people who have done nothing more than gathered to peacefully pray at abortion clinics facing 10-year federal felony indictments. I mean, this type of stuff is beyond outrageous. And but we've seen this here in Texas too. And I tried very hard to highlight this one issue, and I was very enraged on a personal level because I used to help run HHS on a professional level because I'm now a Texas lawmaker, but I watched this lawfare happen in the state of Texas as two brave whistleblowers at Texas Children's Hospital, Dr. Ethan Heim and Nurse Vanessa Sivage, were prosecuted by HHS OIG agents and the Department of Justice, not when we were there, under Joe Biden, okay, because, and what was their crime? What was the massive scandal that necessitated law enforcement prioritization? Well, they thought that there were child abuse happening at a hospital in Texas and that taxpayers were paying the bill. That's what happened. So these two people, the Biden Justice Department, it wasn't enough to say, okay, we don't want to help on this, let's turn the other. No, they wanted to throw them in jail and destroy their lives. That's what the left will stop at nothing in the pursuit of their tyrannical big government ends, guys. And it's about time, I believe, the state of Texas needs to respond accordingly. And I actually think we should have done much more to protect those whistleblowers. But thank God President Trump is there. Thank God his nominee, now Secretary Kennedy and Secretary Bondi, they are undoing this. But you shouldn't have to have your life and your liberty hanging in the balance every time there's a presidential election. That's antithetical to our whole founding. And Texas has got to do more to defend against lawfare when our citizens are on the receiving end. So that's one real quick. And I will go to civil the criminal justice reform issues real quick, because one thing, yes, let's talk about civil asset forfeiture. But before we get there, criminal justice reform. This is a term I don't use a whole lot. I do use it some, but it's got there has been unfortunately a successful effort by some on what I'm going to call the big government right to villainize the term. And when I talk about criminal justice reform, conservative criminal justice reform, I think this is something that every Republican should be supportive of. And by the way, I was in the room in the White House with President Trump when he signed the First Step Act. So let's not pretend this is not something that is, in the Trump. You were there? I missed you. Why didn't you come say hi to me? All right. So I'll just say it this way, because I want to hear her thoughts on this too. But when we're talking about criminal justice reform, you can be tough on crime and pro-criminal justice reform. And in fact, I would say you are not actually a pro-liberty conservative if you do not support criminal justice reform, because I view criminal justice reform as nothing more than a consistent application of skepticism of government actions. It is wholly inconsistent for us as small government, pro-liberty people to say, guys, we don't trust government because government screws up everything it touches, right? Government in all these other areas, we don't trust it. But when it comes to criminal justice, when it comes to the justice system, and when it comes to people who have been accused of a crime, no. Government not only is to be totally trusted, you can't even question government. Let me tell you who would disagree with that, our founding fathers. And it's why they spent go back and read them, the first 10. They spent a disproportionate amount of ink in the Bill of Rights protecting the rights of the accused, not for you not to be protected from him, but for y'all to be protected from the government. So that is what criminal justice reform means to me, a consistent application of a skepticism of government principles. And I'm sure we'll get to civil asset forfeiture, as it is past time we end that abuse of power in the state of Texas.
Well, I'll push it back to you
Go ahead.
on First Step Act. I mean, I was at DOJ during First Step Act. I would say there were a lot of Republicans pushing against that passage when I was there. A lot of politicals too, and it's definitely I think more people have come over to the side where we are. But Brett, I know that was your baby, and honestly, that's kind of where TPPF and Brooke Rollins got involved. And started going up to DC and then eventually becoming the head of Trump's policy department. But that's kind of how it all began.
Oh, it is, and it was Texas that was leading the way on this criminal justice issue, and they were saving billions of dollars, and they were stopping the building of prisons. And why were they doing it? All they were doing was incentivizing those that were locked up to actually improve themselves, and if they did, they were shortening sentences. So we replicated that in the federal legislation, and we worked on it. And I'll never forget, Doug Deason and I were meeting in the bowels of the Senate and the House, and we were in meetings with senators and talking to them about why it truly is and should be a conservative priority to fix the justice system. So we're actually reducing crime and lowering recidivism. And Senator Cruz grew his beard right after meeting with me and Doug. That is a true story. So we know we were persuasive in that meeting. But that was
I got to say, I see Doug right there. I got to make sure I don't talk to the two of you together. My wife would not appreciate that.
No. Senator Cruz during the meeting started going like this. So the First Step Act was an incredible moment. President Obama had the opportunity to pass some pretty significant legislation that would reform the justice system, but he failed to do one thing: try to do it. He didn't put forth any effort whatsoever. It was shocking to people. Trump came in and he had rhetoric about being tough on crime, which I agree, we all should be, and nobody saw it coming because they didn't also understand he had this incredible compassionate side in which he understood that 95% of people get out, and they can be either good or bad. So the focus became then fashioning criminal law and policy to actually lower crime and to lower recidivism. And that's why Right on Crime, for example, we're in 15 states, and we hope to be in all the states so that we're the leading voice, because we never forget about victims, and we actually want to lower crime. Do you think the Democrats want to lower crime? Have you seen any evidence of them wanting to lower crime? Any political DA that's been holding office? No, you do not get a feel from them that they want to lower crime. So that's what we want to do. And it was an honor to do it, and I'll tell you right now, Jessica, myself, Rachel at Right on Crime, many others have been working on the foundational components of a Second Step Act, and the president has indicated, and those around him have indicated, he's not done with the criminal justice system. And thank God that he has that attitude, because otherwise we will continue to see this abuse with such tremendous power.
I do want to touch on a last piece you said there is kind of about state weaponization. And so we've been mostly talking about federal, DOJ, FBI, but actually 90% of crimes are prosecuted by state and local, right? So really your bread and butter crimes are state crimes. So we're hearing a lot in the news about what DOJ, FBI is doing, which is amazing, but we need big reforms at the state level through like a state legislator, but also these DAs.
Amen.
And you guys saw this over the last, decade with these rogue prosecutors. I think Boston, at one point, Boston's DA put out a list of here's 15 crimes you can commit and I will not prosecute. I mean, that's not what we're talking about, right? There's just not enacting the law. There's not law and order, but there's here the law and order, but with a compassion and with an eye towards the future. And I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. Again, we're doing so much of the federal government. We can do so much through a state legislator, but we've got to pinpoint these DAs. And I think it's not, don't just look outside of Texas. They're here, and you guys know that. I think there's been some that have been defeated, but there's some even in counties that we think are maybe red that are still kind of on that line too. So I'd say, really look locally as well, and obviously some of our big counties, but even your specific DA needs to be pushed likely to prosecute more reforms, prosecute more crimes. Just take a heavy look kind of back home as well.
Can I pick up on that just really quick? Because it's not just the DAs. There is a big problem with that. We need much stronger laws. We passed one last session and hasn't done very much. But it's not just the DAs. The state agencies. Many of our state agencies are completely off the rails, guys. I hate to tell you this, but take for example, the Texas Medical Board. All right, these are unelected bureaucrats, by the way, who are still prosecuting doctors for how they tried to treat patients with safe and approved, FDA-approved drugs during COVID. They were pulling the medical licenses of doctors who didn't have politically correct masking policies. And these are the same leftist bureaucrats, by the way, that were enabling child sex change procedures in the state of Texas. This is all happening, but not by anybody you elected. So we've got to so it's not just DAs aren't prosecuting laws. We have rogue bureaucrats that are prosecuting people for violating non-laws. So we got to fix both sides of this equation.
I wish Brian had some passion, you know?
I've only had one cup of coffee this morning.
It's incredible to be up here with, you know, people that have been in the trenches, like Brian and Jessica, and many of us have been in the trenches for many years, and it is not an understatement to say that we're in the biggest fights of our country's life, you know, and it ranges from the bureaucracy and those that hold power in the regulation. I mean, I was shocked to learn not too long ago, maybe it changed under you, Brian, but that HHS had a police force that carried guns.
We have a police force. We actually have a military force. We have the United States Public Health Service Commission Corps. Yeah.
So
the FDA has armed agents, and it was FDA agents with badges and guns that were storming distilleries who were making Purell during COVID.
Yeah. So very few people in the public recognize that each department and each agency has developed their various police authorities, and they're using those, and they're using that,
including the IRS, by the way.
Yeah. So there's work to be done, and I'm glad that Brian raised it. The prosecutors, the rogue prosecutors, have been a real focus of Right on Crime and AFPI, and both of our organizations work very well together and have for years. And we articulate strategies. Sometimes it's litigation, sometimes it's policy, sometimes it's deregulation. It's across the board attempting to try to fix this. On the rogue prosecutor side, look, and the rogue bureaucrat, if you will, the rogue prosecutor side is particularly fascinating to me as this has grown, because why is it when the left implements a policy, it's done so stupidly, right? Like, they announce the crimes they're not going to enforce. What is it you think is going to happen in those? The danger, though, about the regulators is it's all quiet. You don't know that it's happening. So I'm glad that the prosecutors are stupid and they just announce which ones they're not, because we can identify, right? We can identify who they are, and we can address that. It's much more difficult. I was told that leading up to the transition from Biden to Trump, that there were in the 5 figures individuals attempting to embed themselves in career positions in order to undermine what would happen when the new cabinet leaders came in. This has happened before, but never on the level that we've seen. That's why you saw FEMA dollars that went to hotels in New York still, right? And that's why it's super important. I hope that DOGE will quickly turn attention to also the criminal justice system. Yes, I think we'll see the lines of power run along the lines of funding. And so I would open it up. What do you two see is going to happen with DOGE, if you have insight, and should states be replicating this?
Yes, to the second, but I'll let Brian jump on that. But the first one, I mean, I think what we've seen too, and I think most Americans know this, but the money is so important. So when I was at DOJ, the last office I held was overseeing about $9 billion that was not taxpayer funding, was all through criminal penalties and fines, but it went out back to the states, and it went out towards victim funding, a lot of human trafficking, or combating human trafficking funding. We're the largest federal funder to combat human trafficking. So what we saw, though, is when we were getting the applications, we have to put the money out. We have to put out about $3 billion a year through congressional mandate. The funding requests we would get, 95% very left-wing NGOs. And again, that funding has to go out. And the policies they're pushing through that funding, again, is not in line with, I think, the majority of taxpayers, or at least 50% of taxpayers. And so what we saw from the last DOJ and what you're gonna see again is policy made through conditions, grant conditions. There's some right now for sanctuary cities. So if you're a sanctuary city, you might not get funding, or you're not gonna get funding. But that's the way we affect policy, is through the money. And you saw that back, years ago with the speed limit changes, right? So if people wanted federal highway money, they had to decrease their speed limit. And so the same thing, we're doing that. And you look and say, oh, some of those states, the liberal states, they're not gonna agree, they're not gonna change their funding. This is how we make them change their change their policies, is through funding. And eventually, they need the funding. Their local law enforcement needs the funding. So that's how DOJ is affecting policies in the states. But again, you see DOJ cutting, and you see agencies are going to do this through their grant funding, kind of push those policies out throughout.
Obviously, the swamp hasn't driven through Wyoming. You want to have the speed limit as high as possible to get through Wyoming. Brian.
I want the speed limits higher in Texas too, but that's just me. So I have a lot of thoughts about this. As far as should we do a DOJ in Texas, at the conceptual level, absolutely. Because when we're talking about DOJ, what we're talking about is shrinking government and taking on the regulatory state. Those two things have to happen in the state of Texas, and they have not been happening in the state of Texas. But to maybe get a little bit more high level on it, it makes sense in the federal government, in the executive branch, in a very different way than it might make sense in the legislative branch. And I'll tell you what I mean by this. Like, it makes a lot of sense for President Trump to do a DOJ because he's going to do something that you mentioned to this a second ago. The reason state agencies, even when you have Republican leadership, you rarely, you almost never see deregulatory actions, because to do that, the executive has to make a voluntary choice to take power away from themselves and push it back to the legislature. Well, thank God we've got a president now who's willing to go back and basically tell all of his agencies, hey, go confess error, give power back to the Congress. That's what they're trying to do. It's what I was trying to do at HHS, and just for some scale of this, how big it is, just HHS alone, I had 100,000 employees, I had 85,000 contractors, I had 26 divisions, I had a $1.6 trillion with a T dollar budget to manage, okay? The amount of power that those 85,000 people has dwarfs the power of the Congress. And so for President Trump to tell his bureaucrats, go and basically open up all the skeletons in your own closets, tell everybody about it, and then nuke the place, all right? That's why DOJ works. But for a second, on legislative branches and DOJs, no, those don't make any sense, because a legislature doesn't need a DOJ, and I'll tell you why. Because unlike a DOJ, which is like an outside advisory function for President Trump, legislatures already have more power than a DOJ, because all we have to do is take a vote to eliminate programs that shouldn't be there, and we should stop voting to grow government. That's all a legislature needs to do. And so that's the kind of stuff that I hope we can have some success here in the state of Texas passing. And just to tell you how bad this is, when we passed a budget last session, so a year and a half ago, and I know it's question time, but not only did we not cut government, we grew government over 35% last session. So instead of putting the state of Texas, and by the way, every executive branch agency got bigger, every bureaucrat agency got more bureaucrats, and all the bureaucrat power increased. So instead of putting Texas on a path to do something like I think we should do, which is eliminate property taxes, we put the state of Texas last session on a path to double government in 7 years. And the proposed budgets out of both chambers, I have to be honest, they lock in that drunken orgy level of spending from last session, and in fact, they go higher. And so if we pass the budgets as proposed right now, we're talking about locking in effectively 40% growth in the size and crushing burden of government in the state of Texas, whereas I think, and let me know if you agree, Texas should be the lowest government and freest state in the nation.
Well, Brian has some work cut out for him. Questions. We're going to open it up for some questions. We've got a few minutes. Who's running questions? Anybody? Doug? Go ahead, Doug.
Okay. I have a question for Brian, but I think he goes, I've worked with the Trump administration some. And
Maggie's got the mic.
And anyhow, I've worked with the Trump administration during the, advised Jared Kushner on criminal justice reform, and we work on it here. But one thing that I've thrown at them several times from different angles, but it worked great in Texas, everybody talks about term limits, right? Term limits are so important for politicians. They're really not. What's important are term limits for bureaucrats. And if you like put 5 years, call it 5 years, and you cannot work for the EPA, call it any whatever vegetable soup, alphabet soup, it is, and you can never go back. You get 5 years there, and you have to move on. You can never go back. They can't build their power base and that just kind of hides underground and shoots at the president or at the leadership or at the governor or whomever. So I think that's just the whole point of this is Texas should lead on this and put term limits on bureaucrats and then let the federal government follow.
I don't even want to comment. Y'all should just stand up and give him a standing ovation for that. I mean, so I'm going to, and when I say what I'm about to say, you're going to think I slipped him $5 to ask this question. Amen, 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 and amen. Because bureaucrats right now have more power than elected officials. So we've got to clip their wings. We've got to put term limits on it. And I'm going to tell you this is true. Before I left office, okay, so you might have heard of somebody named Tony Fauci, right? Y'all have heard of Dr. Fauci? Well, Dr. Fauci was an HHS bureaucrat, right? So an agency that I was leading, very well paid. Before I left office, and this didn't get a lot of attention, but before I left office, I actually finalized, yes, it's a regulation, but I finalized a regulation to put term limits on every federal bureaucrat at Tony Fauci's level and higher, and we finalized that rule the last day of President Trump's first term, but I hate to tell you, it was the very first regulation that Joe Biden undid was my rule, which would have actually sunset or put term limits of 5 years, the exact number you said, Doug. We have a federal rule, so I would actually beg Congress to go back and now find that rule. Now that Trump's there, pass it via legislation, put it into state statute, and then do that. Because the bureaucrats at these, they build up their own little fiefdoms. They stay there for 35 years, they have way more power than elected officials, and they need to have their power gone, and they need to be term limited more than, quite frankly, elected officials. And by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. I have a bill filed in the Texas House to do exactly that in the state level as we speak right now. We should pass that bill.
In China, they have the social scoring system that if you don't score well, they'll put you in jail and ruin your life. I contend we've already got that going on here in the United States. Your car tracks how many miles you've driven. Your internet correspondences are being seized and searched right through the router right here, right now. My doctor, I said, why do I need my social security number in this form? Government tracking. What can we do?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. You want to take that one?
Yeah. So right now, a major focus of Right on Crime and TPPF is the use of technology and surveillance as well as AI. And it can be used for good, it can be used for bad. The social scoring, I think we are on a fast track to that a few years ago. And I think Trump has it in the crosshairs and his administration, and we've worked on reining in law enforcement use of it. We'll continue to do that. It will be a problem for many, many years, but it is our purpose at Right on Crime to actually assist those that are in power right now to put in guardrails on its abuse.
Yeah, and let me just echo one thing in Texas that we should, again, like everything else, you're picking up a theme. I would like Texas to be leading in these things. And over my dead body, should Texas ever be allowed to become a police state? But we have things like right now with warrantless data collection on Texans who have not been accused or even under suspicion of committing any crimes. For example, I've got a bill right now, please help it move through the process, to ban warrantless collection of license plate reading across the state of Texas. The federal government has no business knowing every time you go to Albertsons or Walmart or to Applebee's. It is not their business. And we need to be setting the bar really high to protect individual liberty and privacy rights, and Texas should be leading on that.
Yeah. So you all have heard of the FISA abuse, right? The Surveillance Act that was, I was part of working in the Senate on passing many of those laws and trying to rein many of those in. Right now, Senator Lee and others are leading an effort to try to rein in the use of FISA against U.S. citizens. I was there in the room when Comey begged for increase in power under FISA and assured the members of Congress it would never be used against U.S. citizens. And now we know hundreds of thousands have been abused. But you all need to get all of your elected leaders to support putting in place warrant requirements when they utilize that power against U.S. citizens.
And since you said warrant, just one word, because it was mentioned earlier, but we didn't talk about it. The state of Texas has got to stop this obscene practice of allowing law enforcement agencies to to take your property away from you without even charging you or convicting you of a crime. Civil asset forfeiture and the termination of it. It is a party platform of the Republican Party of Texas, the Democrat Party of Texas, the Libertarian Party of Texas, and I think it is antithetical to everything we say when we talk about Texas being a private property rights state. If the government can take your property from you without convicting you of a crime, you are not a free people.
I would say, can I jump in just back to the DEI issue again, too? So I think we see, again, the Trump administration is rolling back a lot of this. And I think the left was, as we saw, putting in DEI measures and woke policies through every piece. And we didn't really talk about this too much, but through every piece of the government. So I think you guys all saw about 3 weeks ago, Trump took over the Kennedy Center, and we kind of all laughed and we're like, oh, that's neat. That's, and I love Kennedy Center and go to see shows too. I was having a call with former Secretary Wilkie, he was the Secretary of Interior, and he talked about, he had went to the Kennedy Center during the last administration, and he was up in the president's suite, and he was there with, I think Clarence Thomas, one other Supreme Court justice, and Ginsburg was also in the audience. The executive director of the Kennedy Center got up on stage and just gave just a soliloquy about Ginsburg and, a 10-minute speech about how amazing she was, said nothing about Thomas and the other Supreme Court justice who they knew was there. They were in the president's suite. And so again, I think we saw policy, just in every little piece of our government, and you're gonna see that rolled back. But I do think, we talked about this a little bit earlier too, is we're seeing those roll back through executive order, through changes in the administration, like the Kennedy Center that, again, we kind of all laughed at, but these are big pieces of the puzzle. But again, we need that long-standing change that's going to have to be legislation because they can roll that back. And you're seeing that in the corporate sector too, right? So Facebook's come around to our side all of a sudden, which I'm excited about. What happens again in 4 to 8 years, if policies and the momentum of the public goes another way. So again, we need to really get these things codified at the federal level so they can't happen again in 4 years.
Can I say one thing really fast since you mentioned the Kennedy Center? So somebody who is on the board of the Kennedy Center, a lot of people don't know this, is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who was my direct boss in the Trump administration, but because he didn't want to go, he delegated his responsibilities to be on the Kennedy Center board to me. So I would have to go and suffer through these insufferable board meetings of the Kennedy Center. And the only reason I say that isn't to say it was a cool experience for me, because quite frankly it wasn't. Why the hell are our tax dollars funding these woke, leftist, progressive organizations? And that happens in Texas, including, I know we're at UT, but I'm sorry, the University of Texas is taking your tax dollars and is using it and to be weaponized against you, your values, and your children by promoting this facially racist DEI policies and radically liberal gender ideology. I have had it with my constituents, you, and hard-working, overtaxed Texans being forced to fund the indoctrination of the next generation. That's something we could do, and we could end that this session.
So my youngest son is a senior in college, and I asked him why he doesn't have a girlfriend. He said he hasn't been able to find a conservative girl to date. So I think we're at the end of time, and I apologize for that, but want to express appreciation for Brian and Jessica. Please give them a hand for being here.
Thank you, Brett.
Thank you all.